Okay, so let's look at the epidermis. So if we break this word down, this means epi is a root that means upon. And so this means that it is a layer of tissue that is upon the dermis. So the dermis is underneath the epidermis. So the epidermis is what is found on the surface of your skin, and it is epithelial tissue. So we say that it is epithelial tissue only, but it makes up the outer layer of the skin. So what is really interesting about the epidermis is that it is stratified and it is squamous. So we say that it is stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So using what we've learned previously, stratified means that it is many layers of flat cells. And so when you exfoliate, when you take something that is rough and you rub it against your skin, you're actually rubbing off the outer layer of the epidermis. Not all of it, but just that outer layer of skin. And supposedly that makes your skin look dull if you have too much buildup of the epidermis, because we are constantly shedding the epidermis to our environment. So it is primarily made up of keratinocytes. So it is primarily made up of a type of cell called a keratinocyte. Keratinocytes, cyte means cell. Keratin, you might remember, is actually a structural protein. So this is a cell that is filled with keratin. So if I look at the outer layer of my skin, this is called the stratum. So that's the layer, the stratum corneum. And so this is what we call the apical surface, because this is on the outer. And then we have the basal surface, which would be down here. And so here we have this outer layer, and this consists of dead cells. When we look at the stratum corneum, we see that it can be thinner in some places of your body and thicker in other places. So where we have more friction, like for example, if you work with your hands, you know that you start to build up calluses, right? And so that is a protective mechanism. You get thicker skin in areas where you have more friction. And so that just helps to protect the body. It creates a little extra barrier, okay? So this stratum corneum is the outermost layer. So here we have the stratum corneum. Corneum means like, it's kind of like a hard, right? A hard corn on your foot, for example, would be a hard structure. Okay, so these are the keratinocytes. Now, we also have other types of cells in the epidermis. So for example, we have dendritic cells, and I mentioned those before as being immune cells, dendritic cells. And so these are actually called macrophages, and they are down deeper near the stratum basal, the living tissue. And so they get information about stuff that is growing perhaps on the surface of your skin, and they would send that information into your immune system so your immune system could produce specific antibodies. So we have those dendritic cells. We also have what are called melanocytes. Melanocytes. So these contain melanin. And melanin is a protein, but it gives our skin its pigment. And so melanin, levels of melanin, help to determine whether or not you are light-skinned or dark-skinned. It's a level of melanin. Now, there's actually two different types of melanin. There's eumelanin, which gives you the brown So this is brownish black color. And then we have the pheomelanin, which is more a red. So people that have red hair, for example, or are have like our red hair and have freckles, and they might have the pheomelanin, and this is reddish in color. So this is reddish in color. Okay, so two different types of melanin, and that is determined by your genetics. Now, interestingly, those melanocytes can produce more melanin in response to UV radiation. So for example, tanning. If you are outside in the sun, you are going to produce more melanocytes and you might get darker. If you tan using a tanning bed, that's the same thing. You have UV radiation, and that could also cause you to tan, right, to get darker. And so that is a way to acclimate to the environment to protect against UV radiation. So these melanocytes are really important. People that lack melanin would be like, for example, albinos. And albino people have a big problem in that they have to protect themselves against excessive UV radiation because they have no pigment that helps to protect their skin. And so we'll talk about skin cancer in another video, but that the most deadly type of skin cancer is actually melanoma, where those melanocytes become cancerous. Okay, so if we look at the other cells, we have these basal cells. And the basal cells are what give rise to the other cells. So they are the ones that actually in the basal stratum basal layer, those are the ones that give rise to cells. So that is the ones that are undergoing mitosis. So this is my stratum basal. So these could include basal cells, or do include, that undergo mitosis. And so mitosis is a type of cell reproduction that is different from meiosis, that involves the cells just reproducing and making copies of themselves. So when we look at our skin is actually constantly, here's my stratum basal, is constantly producing new layers. Those cells that are produced migrate up and then they are sloughed off. The melanocytes stay down here near the stratum basal, but the keratinocytes are become developed as you go up. And so there's two other layers here, the spinosum, where the cells get spiny shaped and they actually make connections with one another. And then the granulosum, that's where they start to produce granules of keratin. And so you can actually see the difference between these cells. So if we look at them in more detail, so this is my, my layers. These would be the dead cells filled with keratin. Some of your skin actually has a second layer called the stratum lucidum, and this is like where you have calluses on the bottoms of your feet, or maybe you might see thick skin on your palms of your hands. This granulosum, they have granules that are producing keratin. And then the spinosum is where we get these connections between the cells. And so those, that spinosum means prickly layer, and those, that is where actually the dendritic cells are located for the most part. And then we have the stratum basal, which is where the cells are going to undergo cell division. And notice that this is where the melanocytes, so this is an example of a melanocyte right here. And then we have a neuron, a sensory neuron. This is called a Merkel cell that is able to detect touch. And so there are some cells in your epidermis near the basal layer that allow for cutaneous sensation. So that is your epidermis.